Welcome, everybody. The first thing I have to tell you is that we're being streamed. And for that reason, we'll ask everybody to speak into the microphone when either you're either up here or when you're asking questions, we'll bring the microphone to you. Welcome to this Author Meets Critics in Search of the Global Labor Market. We have one of the three editors with us today and several of the authors. Myself, Marcel van der Linden are authors in this book. Sigrid Quack might join us.
Sigrid has to chair another session.
She's chairing another session, okay. And we'll begin with a presentation by Ursula on the book. We've asked Tobias and Ines to give us comments, so we'll hear both of their comments first, and then we'll open to the audience, and Marcel and I may also respond in part to some of the comments or add a few things, but we're looking forward to your contributions as well. I can announce that the book is published, and in 1 year, it will be published in paperback, so you might want to wait for that because it will be much cheaper. But yeah, hopefully you'll get a good sense today of what the book is about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, also for giving us the opportunity for this Author Meets Critics session on our collective volume, so to say, in the network G here. So my name is Ursula Mense-Petermann. As Karen said, I'm one of the editors of this volume. My colleague Thomas Welskopp, a historian from Bielefeld University, sadly passed away last year. And the third editor, Anna Zaharieva, an economist, she cannot be here today. So I'm glad to be here and to have the opportunity to now very briefly introduce you to what we aimed at with this volume and what we did in the volume. So first of all, let me give you some, okay. Let me tell you something about the context. How did this this book develop? The volume presents the results of a research group that has been working in residence at the CIF, that's Bielefeld University's Center for Advanced Studies, and that was during the academic year 2017-2018. And the research group assembled scholars from across a variety of pertinent disciplines and fields of research, for example, from political science, political economy, from labor economics and migration studies, globalization theory, economic sociology, sociology of work, labor history, and industrial relations. And these are all disciplines that are relevant for scrutinizing cross-border labor markets. And the volume now reflects the research program of the CIF research group. So we hope that we have achieved quite a high level of coherence in this volume. We started this whole undertaking from some initial observations. On the one hand, we saw that the term global labor market in singular is widely used when it comes to accounting for current social phenomena, such as, for example, the ever closer integration of China or India with their huge labor forces into the world economy, or the offshoring of operations of MNCs to countries with cheap labor forces, or cross-border migration more generally. And in most of these cases, global labor markets are taken for granted by the media, for example, but also by consulting agencies who produce data on the phenomenon and by other economic actors. But is there really such a thing as a global labor market? We think that research has not really seriously started to address this question. Because scholarly labor market research conducted in sociology or economics still widely sticks to the national labor market as a unit of analysis. For example, the terms of immigration and emigration that are widely used are, in a way, presuppose national labor markets from which to emigrate and into which to immigrate. On the other hand, migration studies have delivered a whole wealth of in-depth empirical studies on cross-border labor migration and labor market-related issues. But the market concept itself has not been a key concept in migration research. So one can say that border-crossing labor markets, for example, for seafarers, care and domestic workers, construction workers, meat packers, airline pilots, and so on, different sorts of artists, academics, as we are, still lack sufficient conceptual tools to be scrutinized with regard to their transnational properties and particularities compared with national labor markets, notwithstanding works of our critics here today. But overall, there is still a large gap, I would say. And from these initial observations of the state of debate, we took this as a point of departure and concluded that the concept of the global labor market, or rather, as we then put it in plural, global labor markets, or more general cross-border labor markets, all this was in need of theoretical clarification and in-depth analysis. We wanted to understand how, where, and why cross-border labor markets emerge, and that addressing these questions necessitates systematic theorizing and developing concepts that allow for empirically scrutinizing such labor markets. What we wanted to do in the research group and then also in the volume was putting global labor markets center stage and explore them as a phenomenon sui generis. And we wanted to contribute to theorizing them and to develop suitable theoretical concepts that can guide empirical analysis. We also wanted to contribute in-depth analysis of the transnational properties of border-crossing labor markets. And last but not least, we wanted to discuss what the particular meaning of the global in global labor markets could be and whether the term is appropriate at all. In the volume, we wanted also to give room to controversial debates reflecting our discussions in the research group within and between the disciplines involved. And so we developed 4 guiding questions that allowed us to address these aims and which also constitute the 4 parts of the volume. So part 1 with contributions by Marcel van der Linden, who is also here today, Thomas Welskopp, Richard Hyman, and Alexandra Scheele. Part 1 deals with the old question of what exactly the commodity traded in global labor markets is from historical, sociological, and gender perspectives. And the particular question addressed here in this first part is whether free wage labor really should be seen as a key defining characteristic of capitalism, as Marx and Weber had it, or whether forms of unfree labor represent a systematic quality of capitalism as such. Because this then could explain why certain arrangements of unfree labor have survived to this day and seem to be of particular importance in the context of global labor markets. So maybe the main contribution of this first part can be seen in addressing certain forms of unfree labor, such as debt bondage, indentured or contract labor, or the posting of workers. These come to the fore in a global labor market perspective, we argue. And the part also offers some concepts and heuristics that allow to grasp these different forms of unfree labor in today's cross-border labor markets. Part 2 with four contributions by Patrick Aspers, Karen Shire, Peter Paul Benziger, myself, together with Helen Schwenken. These contributions tackle the question of whether the market concept is appropriate in the case of labor markets, given that, with following Polanyi, labor power is a fictitious commodity. So the four contributions offer a critical discussion of applying the market concept to labor markets from different disciplinary backgrounds. And the main contribution of this part may be seen in that, contrary to many migration scholars who are very critical of the market concept, we emphasize that it depends on the market concept to be applied, and that a market concept that allows for addressing and scrutinizing many varieties of different empirical labor markets, and to also consider the particularities of labor power as a commodity. Such a labor market concept is well suited to shed light on properties of cross-border labor migration that do not figure in purely migration-oriented approaches. Then the third part, with contributions by Anna Zaharieva, myself, and Sigrid Quack. This part focuses on market makers, market-making actors, market organizers, so to say, on networks and on institutions, all features that help solve the coordination problems that are amplified in labor markets once they cross national borders. And the main contribution here perhaps lies in emphasizing that cross-border labor markets are characterized by a multi-layered embeddedness on different scales. So the regional scale, national, world regional like the EU, and the global scale. And among these scales, the national scale, we agreed on this, is of pivotal importance, but not alone, not sufficient for explaining the emergence and functioning of cross-border labor markets. So the contributions stress the importance of focusing on the other layers of embeddedness and also on their interaction. Last but not least, part 4 with contributions by Eleonore Kofman, Rebecca Gamble-McCormick, and Martin Bühler and Tobias Veron. This part finally addresses the question of how the global labor markets might be understood. And the three contributions discuss three different ways of making sense of the global. The first way is to conceive of the global, as I just said, as a specific scale or layer beneath others, the regional, the national, the world regional. Then a second way of making sense of the global is not to understand the global as pointing to real flows of goods, workers, and so on, but to conceive of the global as global horizons that then orientate workers' actions and decisions towards maybe migration decisions. And a third way is to conceive of the global in terms of global institutions, such as, for example, the ILO, or maybe also global union federations, global institutions that regulate and maybe thus also constitute cross-border labor markets. So our the contribution here lies in seeing that if defined as real global flows of workers or globally integrated labor markets, then truly global labor markets can hardly be identified. But we agreed that nevertheless it makes sense to speak of global labor markets in order to stress the global properties of border-crossing labor markets as just indicated. Okay, and then the volume ends with a conclusion chapter by the three editors and also some avenues for future research. I'm not going into detail with this now, but I'm looking forward to the comments of our two discussants, and I'm very glad that you agreed to act as critics on our volume here. Thank you.
Okay, we can ask Ines maybe to
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on this excellent book, In Search of the Global Labor Market. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'll just look at my notes a little bit. I really enjoyed reading this book because it brings together this lively discussion on the global labor market, or markets, as you pointed out, from these very different angles, right? So you have the fields of economics, sociology, migration studies, history, political science, social policy, industrial relations, management studies. So this in-depth engagement from the different perspectives on this common topic really engaged me and fascinated me and spurred the thinking of this issue a lot of us are struggling with, looking at from an empirical point of view, to see what the different possibilities are to engage with it. And this book is helpful in that because I think it creates this narrative by way of offering these perspectives and approaches to firstly think about to what extent global markets have actually emerged in the first place. And if so, then how are these structured? What enables labor or capital to cross borders, to transgress boundaries? And then what importance does this have for the lives of workers? And for the reader, as you mentioned, this discussion you must have had at the CIF really translated to the page, I think. The discussion within the group, right? You have different chapters speaking to each other, arguing a little bit with each other, but I think that's worth. So it translates to the reader, but also inspires, your thinking further about these topics. And whilst the title of the book could be interpreted as If We Are Still to Search for the Global Labor Market, the introduction or quite early on in the book, it becomes clear that the contributors to the project and the book, I suppose, rarely see, as you mentioned, this truly emerging global labor market in the sense that workers compete for jobs and employers compete for workers, so that this actually rarely exists. But what does emerge from the discussion is that one can rather talk about this cross-border or transnational labor markets that are regionally bound but globally embedded. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. And obviously that resonates with my research on posted work, which is this case of a cross-border or transnational labor market that is very much regionally bound, but also sectorally concentrated. So my impressions of the book are then naturally shaped by this work that I've done in the field. And this case of posted work provides an extreme but also obvious case, right? When workers are caught in between national regulation and transnational employment processes. So to me, what really spoke to me in the book was this discussion and consideration of the role and impact of layers and scales of embeddedness in addition to the national market. So the local, national, as well as supranational or other transnational regulatory forces. But also in addition to engaging in these different levels of analysis, the contributors within it not only examine these empirical phenomena tied to labor markets that span borders in different forms and guises, as well as the implications for various groups of workers, but there's really this deeper theoretical and historical analysis tied to what our understanding or the particularities of these markets are, and what can be considered a commodity within it. So overall, the chapters are really detailed and a pleasure to read, speak to each other, argue with each other, and certainly contain too much analysis that I can address here. But in that sense, as good books do, they raise also questions more than they can answer. So, and I specifically think this one, I read it in the sense that it encourages debates and dialogue and inspires further discussion amongst those subdisciplines, if you will, rather than creating or providing all the answers to the certain phenomenon of the global labor market. So I have sort of two questions, I think, that I thought might be interesting to raise in this setting here. So first, I found myself asking throughout the book, who are the authors arguing with, or who would find the core findings or arguments most surprising? And so I'm engaging a lot in the field of employment relations or industrial relations, situated in more the pan-European labor market or the European space. So it's sort of this particular lens, obviously, that I'm taking with me. But I suppose in this discussion, there's broad agreement that we do need to analyze the different levels and cross-border and transnational connections between them in order to understand better the impact these markets have on workers' employment relations, how to regulate them, how certain actors behave in these markets. So trade unions, employers, but also other employment actors such as temporary agency workers, subcontractors, sort of the actors you also mentioned in the book, right? And this very much speaks to the insights of the book and certain chapters within it, and also this mentioning that there's too much of Eurocentric focus, which I also agree with. But just looking at the level of analysis, and concretely for the EU example, this means looking at different scales and levels other than the national one. We see that the existence and importance of this transnational labor market and the variegated issues it poses for workers and different groups of workers has been quite intensively explored, and also in industrial relations there's very much focus on the sectoral level as opposed to the national one. So I don't think that means that it's not important to further engage with the different levels, but I wondered whether it might not be as controversial a point as some of the chapters make it to be. So I would just be interested, to have a further discussion about this and hear your thoughts about the importance of the levels and where we should move towards, maybe in addition to the levels that we're looking at, or whether we need to make certain connections. And again, I agree with the book's insights that the national does remain important, but I suppose we just need to have a further or broader discussion about those different levels. And then second, but a very much related point, is that the book acknowledges that at least with regards to low-skilled labor, sociological, anthropological, socio-geographical approaches, and you also mentioned that in your introduction, and I would also add employment relations studies, have delivered this rich account of in-depth empirical studies on cross-border or transnational labor markets in specific sectors. And also in the book, there are these chapters that look specifically at those markets, right? So we have Alexandra Scheele's chapter, but also your Ursula Mense-Petermann's chapter in the book look at the specific types of markets that could be either be cross-border, transnational, maybe even global in Alexandra Scheele's account. But I wondered, so if you are to search for the global labor market, I wonder why there's little engagement, at least as a starting point or basis of discussion, on those specific research findings that do exist, that we have already on global labor markets, which you mentioned, maritime workers, sports labor market, possibly certain high-skilled professions. But also then again these days how certain global labor markets emerge that are enabled by changes in technology that match workers from different geographies through certain online interfaces. And even though these markets do not make up a high percentage in total, they still might be important for a sector or for a profession, and so would also offer important insights about processes of power relations, regulations, what the enablers are for those markets to take place on possibly a global scale as opposed to other markets, and the implications on worker voice, collective action. So I would just be interested, based on the discussions you had within your research group, what you would say the next steps are for the further research. So is it worth to keep searching for the global labor market or markets? And do you now develop the tools to engage with those different empirical phenomena further? Or is it worth to focus the attention elsewhere, to these regionally embedded markets, cross-border or transnational markets? And do we, need to distinguish these different? Well, I suppose I'd be interested to hear: is it the common denominator you could find within the research group is the cross-border and transnational market because of differences in opinion, or was it an unequivocal decision to say it is not taking place? So that's just something I'd be interested to hear more about. What about these global markets that do exist, but that you depart from to a certain extent? So those are my two comments overall I can offer, and it's a great collection of very different perspectives that I think really speak to each other and inspire a discussion and critical comments, and I think for specifically taking us further in different theoretical and empirical work will be very useful as a compendium to engage with. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
So I have comments that fit with Ines's to some extent. Ines, so you think of yourself as an IR person?
Well, as I said, I engage with those discussions.
But you come from sociology, or?
I am a political scientist.
Political science on paper. Okay.
Who knows what I am these days?
Yeah, but that's an interesting one, I think, particularly for the background of this volume, how we are shaped by our disciplines and how research questions are formulated, the scope of them, just the ontology motivating particular epistemologies, etc. So first of all, thanks for inviting me to read this volume. I should have read this volume, but I probably wouldn't, even without this panel, but I probably wouldn't have read it as quickly or right now. But I appreciate having read it right now, even before I've ever seen the title, to basically looking at the page proofs. I do hope that the editors will find a way to maybe distribute some chapters if people are interested, even before the paperback version comes out, because the 140 euros for the hardbound one is quite steep. Yeah.
I have a promotional discount code put on the board.
Yeah. Yeah, we have libraries. That's good. They just have to be convinced to buy them. Okay, so I said already, thank you. So I'm German, and I study Europe, and I'm a white male studying Western first world problems. But at least I do a little bit of transnational stuff in that I work in the U.S. And that's also a first world country, but like with the problems that present themselves somewhat differently at times. And there at Rutgers University, where I work, I'm the co-director of the Center for Global Work and Employment Relations. I do that together with a colleague of mine who comes from China, who would have loved to travel to China over the last few years, but hasn't really been able to. So anyway, we try to have a really global lens, and we have graduate students who have set up a group working with students who are studying southern Argentina, the Philippines, Namibia. I mean, there's really this attempt to be global, even though we are centered like in some global north, in the center of global capitalism, I suppose. And why am I saying these things? I don't know. I don't usually talk about my possessionality, and I mean that's of course something we do more often these days. But I think it's important as we engage with a work like this, which has so many positionalities and tries to bridge and create commonality. I say it also because my department at Rutgers, I mean, how do I say it? My experience in that department is very similar to reading this book. Because we have historians, we have legal scholars, we have sociologists, we have a couple of anthropologists, a few economists. So the questions that are raised in this book and the challenges that book faces is my daily work. It's the daily excitement that I have, but it's also daily frustration that I have. And that I do believe in interdisciplinarity, but then we're all rooted in our disciplinary cultures and promotion and et cetera. That's all like still in these particular silos. I also can relate to this SIF project, even though I've never done a SIF project, because I recently did what's called a seminar at the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers, where they bring together an interdisciplinary group. And we did this on the university and its publics. And it was just a great experience. And I wished we had done a book like this, actually, to put to paper the conversations that we have had. So one plug, and then I get into the book. As I'm struggling with this multidisciplinarity where I work, I've tried to define commonalities within it and core propositions. And so I also edited a book. It's being discussed, including by Karen this afternoon. And it's a different book. It also has multidisciplinary perspectives, but rather than celebrating the multidisciplinarity and showing the cracks and showing the tensions, I still, as the editor, because I think often it's the editor's work, try to pull certain things out in a way and then frame a common message. And that's something that's not so much here, and it's good that's not here. It's just a different type of putting together an edited volume. And I think that's something that Ines has already raised, how there's a lot of questions. It's particularly conceptually rich, also empirically, but it's more really a conceptual volume. But it doesn't try to, or the editors don't try to like force it into something. And I think that's honest, and it also is very valuable. So the book takes as its starting point the global labor market, and I don't know, in various chapters people Googled it, so I don't know how often is it mentioned on the internet, 16 billion times. I think the transnational labor market was only mentioned 4 million times. I noted 16 billion and 4 million, that's quite a huge difference. So global labor market seems to be very, very popular. And I like how the introduction quotes Marx, that all things have to be disputed. What does it mean to go beyond the nation? What are markets? How we conceptualize exchange even outside of markets? All these things that I think Ursula already mentioned as she talked, and you already went over the 4 sections, so I don't have to recapitulate them. If I were to characterize this volume, I would call it a careful exploration, or maybe an intellectual journey of a group. And I don't know, maybe I haven't even read the CIF promotional material, if that's what they're trying to do, but that's really how it felt. And at times it was a conversation, at times it was more controversies, and I do like the idea of a search in the title. And just Marcel is sitting here. I was wondering how you felt when Richard Hyman commented on your propositions in your chapter. And he has this introduction in, like, I don't know what the exact word was, like, he characterized your call for, removing the market metaphor, or the free labor or market metaphor. I don't recall the adjective he used, but kind of you were out there. If we follow you, then we can just forget this whole project, I don't know. It was nice. It was nice to read this openness, and also it was nice to get the sense of the clarity of disciplinary commitments. I mean, what each discipline really brings to the table. Often, disciplines are just in their silo and they don't see the rest. And here there's a clear engagement, but also defending turf and defending probably the normative or ontological commitments that drew each of the contributors to their particular field of study. Clearly, a lot of ground is covered. What spoke to me, I just highlight like 3 themes, because we engage with this, as Ines said, through our own work, through our own positionality. I really like the discussion of free, unfree labor. What is the feature of capitalism? Do we follow Marx, Weber or not? Are they right? Or is Sven Beckert right? And like in terms of unfree labor, feudalism creating the basis for capitalism. It's like something that I didn't grow up with, and it was very accessible to kind of engage, and I really appreciated that, and I found it intellectually rich. I also found rich, and that's something that Ursula didn't mention so much, the discussion of the different types of infrastructures that enable cross-border flows. The institutional, the social, the ideological, that resonated with some stuff that I know of in comparative political economy and different ways of conceiving social action, ideational, the institutional, interest-based. I found points of context, I guess that's what I want to say, in different parts of the book. And I could see as I was reading it and engaging with it how just there were bits here and bits there that really related to my research and would help my own field, comparative political economy, tremendously. So I think it was in Marcel's chapter, but it certainly was one of the historical chapters. It was about employer segmentation strategies, how you wanted to have a mix of free and unfree labor, and there was this openness, like, okay, that unfree labor can be based on slavery or some kind of bondage. And, I was, again, working in the US, flabbergasted and reminded that before the slave trade, that 70% of work in North America and the British colonies was performed by bonded white labor. It's not something that's in the foreground. But what I liked about it was like this, okay, so employers have interest in a segmentation strategy. That my colleagues working on dualization in comparative political economy and who are influenced by the insider-outsider theories of economists would really benefit from that, rethinking that, well, it's employers who have an interest in breaking up the labor force. It's not just privileged core workers who are defending their interests. In Ursula's chapter on the historical development of the German meat industry, I wondered, like, is the German case really that unique with these little butchers and like no large-scale abattoirs? And I was thinking, oh man, how in the US and Upton Sinclair and the description of the meat production in Chicago, did we never have something like that in Germany? This really opened really interesting questions that also spoke to my own personal interest outside of my scholarly concerns. So I don't really have big criticism, but I have like questions. So you said a few things when you presented the book, Ursula, about the background of it, but I actually would like to know more. There's a lot of referencing of the work done in Duisburg on transnational and cross-border labor markets, and Rutgers and Bochum, and I just would like to know a little bit more about the positionality of this research subject in German academia or international, how you thought about this. Is like, in part, and I did research the different contributors and learned about the untimely death of the historian who led this project. But I also noticed that the voice of the economist wasn't very strong. The chapter by your colleague, the labor economist, is on the importance of social network for finding jobs abroad, I believe. And it's not really core econ theory at all. And So anyway, that would help me, and I think that's also something that Ines brought up. Who are you arguing with? Where you're sitting, and then where are you going? I mean, is this like a future of idea? Is the idea that this is a core concern of sociology, social sciences, maybe even the humanities in Bielefeld? Yes or no? That would help in terms of judging, what the conceptual contributions are. Right now, the introduction and the conclusion are rather short. And the conclusion, it focuses on core conceptual questions that come out, but it doesn't really settle on anything. It says, well, we can, I don't recall, but like they usually under each heading for each concept, there are 3 types of conceptualization. And it makes me wondering, what do you want to do with that? In the introduction, it talks about that the volume tries out different combination of conceptualization and tests it against the empirical evidence. There's some of that, particularly in the middle. But I would think that you would want more of that in the future. And so I would just like to know more about that. This whole theme about how can we get from deconstruction to reconstruction, and do we want to get there? I don't know. You could just be critical and then you don't have to reconstruct. Great. Okay, so I do think, it's totally fine, of course, to say the global labor market is often thought about these in terms of like these experts who can work anywhere, and I think you're citing Richard Münch, I think, on that, like that this is global, they can go anywhere. They're not these elites. He has this idea of these like elites who are like totally mobile, but I wonder if it's just like what's the word? It's not a boogeyman. It's like it's overpainted, even that. If you just think about Ines and me. I guess like I'm not sure that I'm the local elite, but we are certainly knowledge workers. And in academia, it's so clear that if you are in Norway or I'm in the US, there are particular tenure standards. I don't think I can the labor market isn't fluid where I am. So I'm just wondering if I guess. If the image of the global labor market is really about this expert labor that can be anywhere, I don't see this. Clearly it's in the book that you cited, but I wonder if that's really the referent for the global labor market. And you I think I was in the introductory or conclusion or in some of the chapters. Global labor market is cited by The Economist. Is this really what The Economist talks about? And makes me wonder about the scale and scope of the phenomenon that you're looking at. I think often global labor market is quoted in Ines mentioned that too, in the context of technological change and how, in the context of digital platforms, how suddenly there's this global competition and how workers in one locality are in competition with another. It's totally without flows. They don't have to be mobile because capital is mobile, and that makes the labor market already global. And I'm thinking about, let's say, the case of IBM. IBM used to be an American company in terms of its workforce. Now it's an Indian company in terms of its workforce. And so the American workers lost their jobs because Indians took their job. Or the jobs were also reformulated, but nobody actually moved. The Indian workers, then they do work in neighboring countries as consultants, but that's only during the week, Monday and Friday. So what's the conception of the global, and is it necessary for workers to flow? It clearly comes out of migration studies, and as you were saying that, I got a bit more clarity on why that focus is, but as I was reading it without that background, I was wondering about the focus on flows. So, yeah, I think if you had you talk about trade liberalization, but if you also talked about technological change, you might have that issue might come up more in terms of, and maybe capital mobility would also shift the conversation somewhat. And then I wonder what economists would say. I already mentioned that your Economist co-editor, she was I don't know if any other economists were involved, but she was the only one who contributed a chapter. And certainly the book that I edited and that we're discussing this afternoon is good at criticizing economists and you're wrong and all of that. And certainly my Marcel chapter says so emphatically too, and I have a lot of affinity with that. But I wonder what the economists would say. I recently attended a virtual seminar with Darren Arsamoglu, and he just basically doesn't care about the rest. He doesn't need to care. He just says, it was a seminar where he was defending his research on the skill biases of technological change, and then somebody asked him, but the processes that you described, don't they coincide with institutional changes like market liberalization, etc.? And he just says, I haven't seen any data on that. So he doesn't even have to consider that as an alternative hypothesis to what he's describing. He's just like this. So I wonder. I just wonder in terms of if we want to have a multidisciplinary conversation, should it be framed against economists? Should there be space with economists? They are supposed to be the discipline that studies markets, or at least they claim to, and they have all this theory about scarcity and all of that. I don't know. I'm probably running out of time. My phone shut itself off. Okay. And in that context, I wonder about the concept of human capital, because obviously that is a core concept that economists use, and I already mentioned it with Arsamoglu. But so they don't actually think much about labor anymore. They think about human beings as capital. And when we talk about the global labor market, they think about countries being rich or with low endowment in human capital, and that's seemingly how corporations think about it too. And they invest there, and they invest there, and I think that's the context in which people talk about the global labor market, but it's through the lens of capital. And then there's also the cultural theorists who talk about people as capitalists and the entrepreneurial self and all of that. That would be interesting to bring in, but maybe you don't have to. I'm just wondering. Another thing that you could think about would be if you talk about global labor market, and markets are really about the division of labor to some extent. At least that's what I teach my students, about people specializing in different activities. And if we do that, should be engaged with the evolving global division of labor. Substantively, where is the labor provided, the labor effort, the labor power provided? Again, you don't have to, but it's something that came to my mind. And then lastly, just because I spent the last 2 weeks in Berlin and I saw the ads for Nancy Fraser's Benjamin lectures, I'm wondering about how we think about labor and the intersectionalities with other themes. So there is the reproduction angle, gender angle is clearly here, strongly represented with a couple chapters. There's a little bit on race in the historical chapters, but not so much on the European chapters. Guest labor a little bit, but it's not really highlighted. And so Nancy Fraser, in her Benjamin lectures a few weeks ago, looked at different forms of labor through the lens of labor protests, and she thinks about feminism, anti-racism, and decolonialization as particular labor struggles. And I'm not saying you have to go there, but I'm just wondering, since other people are problematizing what labor is and how we think about labor and how labor is segmented structures, that might be something you could also explore. But that, again, that depends on where you want to take that and what the next steps are. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you to both Ines and Tobias for raising a number of, I think, very important issues for discussion, but mainly for highlighting how, on the basis of this volume, research should proceed, which I think is a very constructive way to start. Ursula, would you like to respond to a few things, and then maybe Marcel and I might say a few words and go from there?
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting comments and for really going deeply into the volume. Both of you were asking where exactly the volume is positioned in the scholarly landscape. And I would say, I would certainly concede that we perhaps did not or missed out on some literature that's out there and that could have been addressed. But generally, I would say the volume is positioned between, and I now streamline very much and make it simple, and do not consider all complexities. But overall, the volume is positioned between a labor market research that mostly uses the national frame of reference for labor market research on the one hand. So there we have really the labor market is center stage there and is the object of analysis, so to say. And the concepts are reflecting this. And on the other hand, migration research that is dealing with crossing borders, with border regimes, visa regimes, questions such as how is it possible, who is making it possible, who is enabling crossing borders, finding jobs, and so on, but not in a market or labor market frame of reference. Yeah? And in between, we thought there is a gap. And you are right, there is research. I mean, you have both contributed to that, but it's still a minority stream in the scholarly landscape, I would say. It's still the case that most of labor market research is addressing national labor markets and sometimes immigration into and emigration from national labor markets. But that misses out, as you said, the transnational properties and embeddedness in institutions and market makers. And on the other hand, migration research is not very much interested really in, I mean, they do address labor migration, but they are not really interested in the matching of workers to jobs, so to say, but more in questions like how to cross borders and things like that, and the role of networks and things like that. So all in all, I would say we were interested really in the question of, one of the starting points was that cross-border labor markets do not emerge from scratch. They need enablers, so to say, to overcome the difficulties that emerge when workers are matched to jobs over borders. Because all the institutions in the national institutional settings that enable this cannot be taken for granted at the transnational level. So that was mainly our point of departure. And yeah, okay, I'll leave it with this. Tobias, you pointed to the joy it brings to work with colleagues from other disciplines, but also the challenges connected to it. And this is true also for our group and our volume. And as you said, there were several economists in the group, but only one contributed chapters. One reason is just that economists often don't like writing book chapters, but aim at highly ranked journals. So there's a difference, and I think we do not hide it in the volume, as you said, Tobias. It was from when we had the idea to publish the results of our discussions, we termed the whole undertaking collective volume, because we wanted to stress that it's a collective product, but it's not streamlined in any way. It's with the economists, we even could not agree on a common market concept. Yeah, but still the discussions were interesting, and we all learned from that. And also with the historians, Marcel, I think we really had discussions, but
you never agreed with me.
No, and you not with me, but I think we enjoyed our discussions, and at least I learned very much from discussing with you and Thomas and Peter Paul. So, yeah, it is like it is. It is, I would say, particularly with economists, it's hard to collaborate, and it's even harder or not possible to streamline a common result. So we just decided to lay open the debate that we had. Other questions? Labor markets enabled by technology, also a point that both of you mentioned. Yeah, I would say there's really a gap. That might have to do with the fact that click work and platforms have come to the fore and have been focused more during the past few years, and it's now a while that we were working together at CIF. It was not that much in our focus at that time, and there was just nobody in the group focusing empirically on this labor market. But this is definitely an avenue for future research, I would say. Ines was asking, or both of you were asking for where to go on from this. And I would say one thing is, let me start again with another thing, the global labor market. I mean, it is clear that I think also how we put it, that this is provocative, and the global labor market in singular. None of us, I think, was thinking that you will find many or one global labor market in singular. And even if you put it in plural, you wouldn't find many if you would understand it like a really, like Richard Hyman put it, a market constitutes a price. Yeah, it's not just counting the numbers of a global labor force and global jobs, but it's about matching and about having one price in the market. And if you think of it like that, there is no one global labor market, and not even many global labor markets in plural. So that was a provocation, so to say. But still, this provocation led us to think about global embeddedness of cross-border labor markets. And I think here, now when we come to avenues for future research, I think what is very much under-researched are the horizons that orientate people's decisions regarding migrating or not, where to migrate, which jobs to take up, and so on. So this, we had Karen, we organized at SASE Kyoto a panel on transnational labor markets, and there was a very interesting presentation on Indonesian care workers who go abroad to work, and how they thought about the world in terms of a hierarchy of like Canada in first place, and then if you do not manage to go to Canada, what comes next? Yeah, Taiwan and so on. And questions like this, I think, are very much under research. And a second, and then I will stop and maybe give Marcel and you, Karen, the word. I think infrastructures, and that was something that you, Tobias, were pointing to, also material infrastructures, and infrastructures in terms of like intermediaries, brokers, market makers, more generally, so-called migration industry. Yeah? Who are those corporate actors who enable cross-border labor markets to emerge? I think that's also an under-research question. That would be, for me personally, these would be the direction where I would like to go to. But I think that Karen and Marcel would like to.
Thank you, Ursula. Marcel, would you like to make a few comments?
Okay.
Yes.
Very briefly, 3 points. One thing which I discovered again, but which I knew already, was that the dialogue with economists is very difficult, and you confirm that as well. much more difficult than the dialogue with anthropologists, sociologists, for historians, I mean, or political scientists. And that's because they think they have to develop a discipline like physics, with mathematical things, data all the time, and models and so. And then a dialogue is not really possible because they don't know really what's happening in the world. They're not interested, in fact, most of them, there are of course exceptions, but most of them are not really interested in what's happening in the world. I don't mean the social economists here, but the economists like in the building across the water here. And so it is also in this, at the CIF, I found it very difficult to have a constructive dialogue with economists, because then they would start to assume this and this. And then I'd say, but this is not a realistic assumption. Yeah, but then I can build a model, you know. So that was one thing. And I don't know how we can solve this, unless we can re-educate the economists, but that will not be very easy. The second thing is that I think in the discussions on the global labor markets, there's a strong emphasis on knowledge workers, and that's not as it should be, I think, because maritime workers were mentioned already, or domestic workers. Large numbers of them are working across the globe, and even ILO Convention 189 about domestic workers recently emphasized this again. And so I think we should also look at those low-paid, dirty jobs and so. And if you have ever done a cruise, I've done once, I will never again, but the cruise is full with Filipinos, and we were going to Norway. So it's that's also a global labor market, which has maybe underemphasized a bit. And then the final point is intersectionality. I have discovered how difficult the study of intersectionality is. I mean, the idea in itself is obvious, but to use it in practice, what you see is that often scholars are capable of integrating a gender and a class perspective, for instance, or a gender and a race perspective. But intersectionality in the original article from, what was it, 1980 or so, emphasized 3 or more things that intersect with this whole idea of the crossing of the roads and so on. And I've never seen an article or a book which successfully really integrates 3 perspectives in the analysis. And in fact, there is an Australian feminist, Anne Thoyes, who also 30 years or 40 years ago wrote an article about the 3-body problem, talking about physics. In physics, you have the Henri Poincaré, famous mathematician and physicist, has around 1900 published an article, a study in which he shows that if you have the moon and the earth, then and nothing else, then you can exactly predict how they will move towards each other, in relation to each other. But if you introduce a 3rd body, in this case, for instance, the sun, then every mathematical model becomes inexact. And she and Thoyes use this from a feminist perspective to say it is not possible to analyze 3 aspects at the same time. You always have to focus on 2, and then you can later maybe add some considerations on the 3rd and the 4th and so on. But it's not possible to have a fully integrated 3-body analysis. And this is a challenge. Maybe she's wrong, but I've not seen an exception yet to her rule. And I would be very interested if you have suggestions for that.
Thank you, Marcel. Let me try to get the camera centered again. This is going to look very amusing when you watch the video of this. I've almost given up. Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, I have to say that I haven't given up on economists in quite the same way. Otherwise, I wouldn't be coordinating the SASE Network G on labor markets, education, and human resources. And our dear colleague David Marsden is an example, I think, of an economist with a very open mind, who one can debate with, and who will always come to sessions where sociologists, anthropologists, and historians are also talking. What I found very encouraging in the SIF group, I had actually debates with my fellow economic sociologist, Patrick Aspas, where he claimed that labor markets are the same as any other market. There's just a few little quirks to them. And the labor economist said, well, we know that labor markets are completely different from any other markets. So I found that actually very, very encouraging, and a basis at which then we could begin to talk about what does it mean to exchange labor power versus other commodities. And we know that there are not just now variations of mainstream economists. In the US, you would talk about saltwater and freshwater, but we also now in our department, where Gerhard Bosch and I are, have an Institute of Socio-Economics, which would not be acceptable in either of our economics departments, which is quite a different style of doing economics, maybe much closer to the history of Volkswirtschaft, which, if I'm not mistaken, is also the degree that Gerhard Bosch has as a labor, the most prominent labor scholar, I would say, in Germany. So I have not given up on economists, and I think that there was. It was frustrating at times, but I think it's a positive tension. And as long as we can have these dialogues, it's true they wouldn't publish in the book, but I think, in fact, that the dialogues that we had in the context of ZIF were very important. Thank you to both Ines and Tobias for these very important comments. I mean, I have to say that the value added by this group might be even more than we could express in the book. And there were some other publications, some of which included, for instance, the maritime industry. But for me, it was, you know, I'm thinking all the time about how to regulate that labor which crosses borders. And I've had some frustration with the global value chains research, as much as I appreciate it, because it never considers how labor is exchanged. It just looks at labor once it lands in the workplace, and I think that's why they think that we need private regulation. But they don't think systematically enough, and there are some people working on the recruitment of labor, about where labor comes from and the conditions under which it's commodified and then exchanged. Because we have a problem now in the world of global labor that, in fact, many of those workers in these workplaces are not disposed towards collective action. They're not disposed towards struggling against the exploitation that they experience. And I think the answer comes much earlier. It has to do with the way that their labor has been exchanged. Many of them arrive in these workplaces with debt. Their families are literally under threat if they don't pay back. Even if that debt originates from their own families, they're expected to send money back home. So there are all kinds of ways in which they are made available for exploitation, which I think you cannot address if you don't consider the conditions under which they've been commodified, mobilized, and exchanged within a market. Now, the market metaphor itself is very problematic, and I often get the criticism in the CIF group from the migration people, because they don't want to look at this as a market at all, because they're thinking about a neoclassical market where it's just determined by prices. And that's where Ursula and I stressed very strongly that the sociology of markets is the very important point here, because you cannot make a market without regulating it. And you cannot make a market without a state guaranteeing certain conditions for that market to happen, which means that we can also mobilize even on the side of employers, there's a need for stability in markets that one could use as a lever, of course, only in a very limited sense, I would say, without any kind of collective action. We won't have meaningful regulations that can enforce worker rights. But this makes clear that there is no market without regulation. It's a matter of what kind of regulations and what is the balance of power, how can we rebalance it so that we can get better regulations. And what I got out of this group really was the issue of transnational regulation of the exchange of labor and kind of busting through the way in which migrant scholars look at it to say, well, we are looking at labor markets, they are regulated, and the question is how and how can we improve on those. I would stop there, and it's always difficult in an author meets critics session to ask the audience to give comments because you would not have had a chance to read the book yet, but perhaps you have comments anyway from your own research on these issues. I can imagine that Gerhard does.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I haven't read the book, so it's difficult to discuss, and I probably just some thoughts which came into my mind. The first point is the title speaks of the global labor market, and I don't see a global labor market. There might be many. You were searching for it, but maybe you didn't find it. Okay, yeah. I don't think there is a global labor market. There are different forms of global labor, of transnational labor markets, and yeah. And the second point is you were speaking of intersectionality, and it was mentioned that we should look at different, let's say, on the knowledge workers and on other workers. Why not using the concept of segmentation theory, which is a solution to some of the problems you mentioned? Probably not the best, but quite a good solution, because there were differentiated different segments, primary segment and secondary segments, or more segments, depending. Within these segments, you can go further with your analysis, and you find that where you pay the lowest wages, you find more women, more foreigners, etc. So this helps you step by step to understand certain markets. And I just published a book on the German construction labor market. And there, it's quite clear that the posted workers, and we have a really segmented labor market. The primary segment of the big companies, the general contractors, within Germany, secondary segment of those working in the subcontracting companies, and then the posted workers, and then the illegal workers. So we can define roughly four segments, which and that's quite interesting. That's a really helpful instrument, and I don't know if you use this. This would be a question. And then I come back to the point which was mentioned by Karen. I think since we have national labor markets, all global labor markets are also some kind of legal constructs. They need some, migration needs some form of institutionalization. If it is illegal, probably after 20 years stay in the US, you get a passport. This is a form also of institutionalization of a former legal ways, and then the transnational labor markets where people are covered by two legal systems. I think that is a basic point of the term transnationalism. Shows that all these markets are institutionalized and not really global. And I don't see a real global labor market. I see supranational labor market, like EU civil servants or ILO civil servants with an own pension system. Yeah. And finally, the last point is space global labor. When we speak of global labor markets, obviously we have in mind that people are moving, and it was mentioned by a few people with new types of technology. You can provide these services worldwide without moving. You cannot, and this changes probably the notion of global labor markets completely. Therefore, an own subject would be to look at the relationship between product markets, which includes goods and services, services you can provide without moving, goods usually not. Some music you can even provide cross-border now with new technology, but most services, most goods not. So the question is, do you regard this as global or not global? If you look at product markets, definitely providing services across borders has also institutional aspects, which are and there are substitutes between labor markets and product markets, which are very important, because then comes up the question of taxation. Who is paying the VAT for this? It's the same like paying social security contributions, and therefore we have also in the cross-border or transnational labor markets we have different forms of mixing up product markets and labor markets, which are completely ignored by, especially in the whole debate on migration. So migration experts are looking on individual migration. They completely forget about the freedom within the EU to set up an own business in another country. And setting up a business in another country means it's a market regulation, a product market regulation. It's not a labor market regulation, and it can be a substitute. If when the German tire occupation was deregulated, suddenly we had a registration of 1,600 tilers per year in the Chamber of Handicraft in Düsseldorf. The years before, we had 65 around. So it was clearly a substitute for individual migration, and therefore I think Ursula mentioned quite often a matching of jobs. This is not a matching of the job in this term of an employee, but it's these are independent worker, and this. I think there are so many thoughts which I have about this. I don't know if you covered this, and I'm sorry if I mention points which are already in the book.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, as regards the title, as I said, I mean, we all agreed that there is not the one global labor market. This was really a provocation. But starting from the observation, and Tobias referred to that if you do a Google research, you get 16 billion results for global labor market. So it is a term that's out there in the world, it's used. And having a look at what does it point to? I mean, it's mainly, it's the media, but it's also consultancy agencies who produce data. It's also the ILO, for example, using this term. And we were just taking this as a starting point to have a deeper look. But we are certainly, nobody in the group believed that there is the one, not even the economists, I think, that there is the one global labor market. The segmentation theory, it doesn't figure very prominently in the volume, but it's certainly many contributions could link to segmentation theory, but I think most of the contributions start earlier, because maybe this question of segmentation and the question of what are the jobs that migrant workers take up, and what structure do the different labor markets have, already refers to what Karen says when they land at work already. And we were more interested in questions like, how is it at all possible that cross-border labor markets emerge, given border regimes, lacking regulation, difficulties of educational certificates and so on. So how do you evaluate the human capital of a migrant worker coming in? Yeah, what are the processes that commensurate different systems of different educational systems and so on. So these were more, I think, questions that we were focusing, like more on the processes that come before workers really take up jobs and certain jobs in a segmented area. Labor markets, cross-border labor markets without moving. Yes, as I said, I would concede that's a gap in the book. We should have had one chapter on click work or platforms. That's missing. But I agree this should be an avenue for future research, particularly in a comparative approach, like comparing this kind of labor markets with others that presuppose moving, and the institutions that enable the one and the others. So that could be very instructive, I think.
It's much more than platform work. The whole IT software, platform work is a small part of it.
Yeah. No, we had that. We had one colleague working on offshoring of IT tasks to Ukraine in that case. We had that in the group, but unfortunately the colleague didn't contribute a chapter. But I agree, yes. If it comes to highly skilled work, this is an important segment. And my approach to all that would be to compare, to try one objective of future research could be to come to different typifications of different kinds of cross-border labor markets, differently institutionally embedded also, or with different sorts of market makers and corporate actors who are important for the emergence of this kind of labor market. That would be how I would approach these questions. But maybe, do you also want to comment or other?
Are there other questions or contributions first?
I would also like to say something, but first maybe you... sorry. Sorry.
Yes. Hi, I'm Helena Hoff from University of Zurich and Max Planck Institute for Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen. So I'm coming from the sociologist and also area studies perspective. But my question was, because we talked a lot about national labor markets and global labor markets, and I was wondering in which way you think the concept of regional labor markets is important, and if you address it in the book, and if then, if that is an applicable concept that you could for different regions use in a meaningful way to drive theory of understanding labor markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Helena. Maybe I can answer this very quickly because in fact, we do think that the markets develop more often in regional contexts than in truly global contexts. And that's maybe one problem with the concept of global labor market. It applies to very specific markets like in seafaring and in global care labor and a few other cases. But even within those cases, as I think your project is showing also, Ines, on the shipbuilding industry, the way that labor crosses borders is usually within a regional context. So there are some big crossings, but in fact, most of it is a matter of comparing regional transnationalizations of markets. So I think I'm going to give the last word to Marcel.
Thank you. Just two things. One is about segmentation. I'm a great fan of Edna Bonacic's split labor market theory, which is also a form of segmentation theory. And it enables us to look at things from a global perspective. But still, I think the segmentation theory starts from the end. We have seen this in several cases, other cases too. It starts from the results. While intersectionality asked the question from how is this constructed? And that is a much more difficult question, in fact, I think, than the segmentation question. Although I agree that segmentation is a very useful approach. Final word about economists. I didn't want to insult all economists, but the top economists, because only they who publish in the American Economic Review and that kind of thing, these people, we cannot talk with them. That's it's also true for Acemoglu and so. It's there's no dialogue possible at the moment, and here I think there's a great challenge for us, which we didn't address fully in the book.
By the way, segmentation is not on the results. It's main point in segmentation discussion is also on the reasons and the drivers of segmentation, and also the possibilities to avoid segmentation. So I wouldn't agree.
This maybe is something we should have a debate on in the next meeting of SASE. And I'll just make a pitch for this afternoon. You may have missed the one before. Ines Wagner's group on the shipbuilding industry this morning was looking at the construction of a global labor market. But afterwards, Tobias and colleagues, a book which very much picks up on what Marcel just said about the inability to have dialogues with mainstream economists, especially within the US context, in how labor studies as a field can basically lead a new focus on the importance of collective action and politics in the reform of labor. It's very much, I think, in a US context, but it's a universal message, and it fits very well with the stream of panels that has been going on in Network G today. I have to leave right away because we'll be having a business meeting in Network G. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ursula. Maybe you would just like to say also a last.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for your interest in our volume. Special thanks to the two critics for your friendly but in-depth and very important readings and comments. And thank you, Marcel and Karen, as contributors for being here and also responding to the comments. I will put a promotional code on the desk. There is some flyers here on the book, giving you some more information on how to use the promotional discount code, 25% off. Yeah, thanks, and have a nice.
It was a pleasure to be in your group.
Thank you, Marcel.